We're just about 2 weeks away from Labor Day. I think it's pretty fair to say that this has been a busy summer. I dare say, even one for the record books. And I'm not talking about the weather. Coming up on this episode of The Eagle, we'll go over the top headlines.
Debates are breaking out all over in school district meetings on the question of mask mandates.
And we'll talk about the revelation that the Albany Diocese sent priests accused of sexually abusing children to treatment centers instead of alerting law enforcement.
In short, the Albany Diocese, along with pretty much every diocese in the country, covered up sex abuse for decades.
If you're enjoying this podcast, take advantage of all the Times Union has to offer and support our efforts to bring you award-winning journalism by becoming a Times Union member today. Go to timesunion.com/subscribe.
This is The Eagle, a Times Union podcast, a look inside our newsroom. I'm Jessica Marshall. First up, let's go over what appeared this week in the Times Union and on timesunion.com.
I am Casey Seiler, editor-in-chief of the Times Union, and here, happy to be talking with our outstanding managing editor for news, Susan Mehalick. Susan, how are you doing on this crazy news week, though not quite as crazy as last week?
Well, I'm doing just great, especially since I heard that Tropical Depression Fred has pretty much dealt us all that he's going to. So it looks like the rain is going to be moving out of the capital region. So that's something that I'm kind of happy about.
Yes, we dodged a bullet. Let us turn our attention from the regional to the global. The big news, of course, over the weekend was the rapid collapse of the U.S.-backed government in Afghanistan and the extreme peril being faced by not only U.S. citizens and forces on the ground there, but especially by Afghan people, especially those who have worked with the U.S. and global forces in the 20-year battle against the Taliban that is now over. This story has had a couple of local elements, including Pete DeMola's coverage over the weekend of the fears of a woman who was identified as Sunita, whose children are in Afghanistan and who obviously she is gravely concerned about.
Yeah, we learned about this story from the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, which has an office in Albany. You know, it was really a harrowing story that Pete told on Sunday about, this woman texting with her children who were in a car trying to get to the airport in Kabul. They're teenagers down to, I think the youngest is 8 years old, and she's very concerned about getting them out. She was able to get out on refugee status because she had fled from Afghanistan to Pakistan at a previous time, and the children were with her husband's family. I believe that her husband is deceased. The kids are safe right now, but they're still trying to get them to this country.
Yeah, the children are basically in the custody under sort of Afghan law of her late husband's family, and she is of course desperate to reconnect with them and of course get them back to the U.S. Pete followed that up by noting that local mosques in the capital region, as well as numerous other organizations devoted to aiding refugees, are sort of standing by and eager, in fact, to assist Afghan citizens who are relocated to the U.S. Here in the capital region, of course, COVID-19 unfortunately continues to be a major story. And right now it is intersecting with what is always a big seasonal story as we approach late August, and that's back to school. Specifically, in the absence, unfortunately, of clear advice from the state health department, debates are breaking out all over in school district meetings on the question of mask mandates and whether individual districts should include mask mandates as part of kind of a varied effort to knock down infections in schools. And Rachel Silverstein wrote about a meeting of the Shenandoah School District up around Clifton Park that turned distinctly ugly on August 10th.
Yeah, there have been a number of meetings. It wasn't just in the Shen district, but there have been a few other districts where they've had sort of contentious meetings about whether or not the kids should be required to wear masks in schools. And, since her initial reporting on that, Rachel has found out that most districts in the region are planning to implement universal mask policies when schools start up. But again, there are still some school boards that are facing strong opposition from parents. And some of them have discussed plans to make masks optional. But it looks like a lot of the districts in the immediate capital region are going to be mandating that, their students wear masks. And then they'll revisit it if infection rates start to, go down in the coming weeks.
Also, Masara Makati has reported that vaccination will be required for football and volleyball players in the Albany and Bethlehem school districts, according to the plans that those districts put out at midweek. Football, of course, is a high contact sport. Volleyball is an indoor sport where you obviously play in close proximity, and there's a lot of handling of the ball. So I guess that's not at all surprising, but I think that is the first time we have seen vaccinations required for students. I could be wrong on that, but I believe that's the case.
Yeah, I think that is the case. And it'll be interesting to see what comes of other outdoor sports. It seems that there's a recognition that football has a lot of contact, but I don't know about you, Casey. I've seen some soccer games where people are right up in each other's faces too. So I'll be curious to see what happens with that.
Turning to a very, very different and perhaps slightly more upbeat story, Chloe Callahan, who is one of our outstanding Hudson Valley reporters, wrote about two Frank Lloyd Wright designed homes that are for sale on a private island that's about 10 acres in Putnam County. There's a lot of talk about stories that are effectively shelter porn. In other words, gorgeous shots of real estate. And this is absolutely triple X shelter porn. These houses are completely gorgeous, and they look like a slightly nicer version of the type of kind of high modernist house you might see a Bond villain working out of.
Yeah, as somebody who's visited Taliesin not too long ago, that's a Frank Lloyd Wright property out in Arizona. I was thrilled that our Hudson Valley friends unearthed this and shared it with the world.
And there's a bit of a controversy surrounding it because the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation recognizes this house, which is known as the Massaro House, as being inspired by Wright, which is a step down from, Taliesin or Falling Water in Pennsylvania, for example, because it was built according to Wright's plans, but built after his death. There's apparently kind of a classic kind of art versus commerce debate surrounding that that's pretty fascinating.
Nonetheless, I would take either of these properties.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'll be happy to live in a Wright-inspired house as opposed to one that was an according to Hoyle, Wright design. Meanwhile, closer to home, going from beautiful design to bad clothing or bad wardrobe, we once again have the return of the crew for HBO's upcoming Watergate drama, The White House Plumbers, and they've been working down in the state capitol complex, specifically in the LOB. It stars Woody Harrelson and Justin Theroux as White House, Nixon era rascals Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy. We have a gallery of just fantastic photos from Will Waldron and Lori Van Buren of people walking around in the most hideous early 70s brown suits you could ever imagine.
What I want to know, Casey, is if you had seen Woody Harrelson pedaling his bicycle on the streets of Albany, would you have known it was Woody Harrelson?
Maybe not. I mean, Woody Harrelson, I guess, is distinctive, but he also just looks like a fairly fairly normal-looking middle-aged guy. In other words, I think I would probably recognize Robert Redford or Dustin Hoffman, to use two other, Watergate-connected actors on the street. Speaking of the story of a chief executive who is forced to resign in the teeth of impeachment, let us, of course, turn our attention to what I think it's fair to say is probably going to be the biggest story of the year. That is the resignation of Andrew Cuomo, which is scheduled to occur as of this recording on Monday night, specifically at midnight on Monday going into Tuesday. And Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul will take the reins. We had, of course, an excellent story from Josh Solomon and Brendan Lyons last Sunday talking about what Cuomo's legacy is going to be. That, of course, it will involve big accomplishments like the passage of marriage equality in 2011, a lot of big infrastructure projects, the Moynihan Train Hall, and, of course, the bridge that is named after his father, but, of course, a lot of ethical troubles, all of which just metastasized over the course of the last year. I mean, a remarkable reversal from a year ago when essentially Cuomo was being hailed as America's governor, when he had secured $5 million for his COVID memoir, American Crisis.
Watching him, during the COVID crisis and those daily briefings, for a long time, I thought he was like in the zone. And then it appeared to me that he was, having briefings when they weren't necessarily needed, and he would go on. And I thought, why isn't someone reining this guy in? It's clear that he operated that way, in his day-to-day, that there were people around him that should have been like telling him, hey, dude, you just don't do that. And apparently nobody felt they could say that to this guy. And it's another example of, somebody brought down by hubris. He doesn't even recognize what he was doing wrong.
Yeah, there's a classic line from the movie Scarface, which is the advice, don't get high on your own supply. When you think of how many of the scandals that came to envelop him, came during or out of this period of great adulation, they all occurred during this period when Cuomo was at or near the top of his game. And you just wonder if this is the case of someone who started, as they say, believing his own press clippings.
Yeah, I think Paul Grandal's column this week where, he described his fall as being, like Shakespearean. I thought that he did a really good job of describing that, because I was like, yeah, that's exactly what this is.
Yeah, Paul noted in that column that he has, in his career, which is a long and acclaimed one, he has only been F-bombed 3 times. And Cuomo was one of them when the governor called him up, upset about a story that Paul had written. I think it was a column that he had written about greeting the public on New Year's Day at the governor's mansion. And the governor did not appreciate it. And he unloaded on Paul. So it's a terrific piece from somebody who, covered Mario and then went on to cover Andrew too.
Yeah, I know. I was in the office the day that Paul got that call, and he was like holding the phone out from his ear. It was pretty funny, from the perspective of a colleague of Paul's in the newsroom.
Susan, thank you so much. We appreciate it. And thanks as always for all the great work.
All right. Nice chatting with you, Case.
As always, you can read more about all the stories and the issues we discuss on this podcast at timesunion.com. After the break, the former bishop of the Albany Roman Catholic Diocese admitted to shielding priests accused of sexual abuse.
Hi, I'm Casey Seiler, editor of the Times
Ed McKinley, who broke
Join us for an ongoing discussion on major developments in the saga of Keith Raniere, co-founder of NXIVM, the shadowy upstate New York organization at the center of the explosive federal investigation that resulted in Raniere's conviction on charges of extortion, sex trafficking, and more. We talk to former members of NXIVM, discuss the latest news, and preview the likely next twists in this bizarre and disturbing story. You can find NXIVM on Trial at timesunion.com or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Welcome back. You're listening to The Eagle, a Times Union podcast. I'm Jessica Marshall. At the end of July, the Times-Union reported that the former leader of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Albany, Bishop Howard Hubbard, admitted that it sent priests who sexually abused children to private treatment programs rather than contacting law enforcement. Reporter Ed McKinley broke the story just before the end of his year-long Hearst Fellowship. It was a part of a series he'd written on the Child Victims Act and the cases that it brought about against the church and others.
Sure. So
I caught up with
the
him
final
before
story
he
that I was
left
working
to discuss his reporting.
was an exploration of the 300 or so Child Victims Act lawsuits that have been filed against the Diocese of Albany. Reporting on the CVA and all the lawsuits against the different organizations, be it the church, the Boy Scouts, schools, summer camps, all these different groups. That was something that I really latched onto early on in my time at the TU. And I found those stories to be really rewarding to work on. I'm sure if you're listening to this, you've heard about the broader awakening that our society's had about child abuse, be it the Spotlight movie that won Best Picture and the Pulitzer Prize for the newspaper articles in 2002 and the laws that have come from that. But honestly, I think as much attention as it has gotten is still not as much as it really deserved. And that's something that I've sort of become alert to the more I've reported on this. So it was important to me to write a sort of bird's eye view story that took in the full scope of what was going on based on the information that we have. There was so much coverage where it was like lawsuit filed against X priest, lawsuit filed against Y priest. Like there was just drip, 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 drip. And I thought it was important that someone take the time to go through all of those lawsuits and all the records that were attached to it and say, okay, we have all these individual stories, but what is the pattern here? What is the information that we can synthesize between all of these different stories? So that's what I did. I took about a month, built a really big spreadsheet, read a lot of records, did a lot of interviews, and put together what I could figure out.
So tell me, we talked about one of your earlier installments of the story in which you kind of took a look at the closing of the look back window. But the last story you wrote was some revelatory stuff about Bishop Howard Hubbard, the longtime head of the Albany Diocese. What was the story there?
In short, the Albany Diocese, along with, I'll add, pretty much every diocese in the country, covered up sex abuse for decades. When they found out about that one of their priests had been abusing a kid, they would keep it quiet. They wouldn't tell the authorities. Sometimes they wouldn't even tell the parents. They would send the priest to treatment. They had these private treatment facilities. There's one right by Toronto. There's one famous one in New Mexico. And then these treatment facilities there would be a doctor and they'd say, oh, we don't think he's going to reoffend again. I have a record from one priest, for instance, where it says, if he's supervised properly, we think there's a low likelihood for him to reoffend. So then the priests get reassigned. They return to positions of trust in the community. Still, no one is told about this. The church now says, we understand that's the wrong thing to do, but it's their position that they were making choices based on the best information available at the time. So yeah, the story in some sense is revelatory because it's gotten a big reaction from people. So clearly the information wasn't sort of publicly understood, the extent of this organized cover-up going on with the diocese. But it was just sitting there in public court records. I mean, they've kind of alluded to it in public statements before, but I think it was just important for someone, and I was happy to do it, to say, hey, this was a chronic thing. This was hundreds of priests. We don't know how many were sent to treatment. They wouldn't answer that question. And a lot of these guys, after they return from treatment, there are then further abuse allegations after that. When I sent to Hubbard, former bishop, and his lawyers all of the evidence that I collected and asked them to respond to a series of questions, Hubbard just, said in his statement, yeah, it was our practice for decades to send priests to treatment and to return them to ministry upon the advice of doctors.
Did you expect him to say that?
I mean, yeah, like without getting too inside baseball-y, like the story wasn't even originally written with that as sort of the lead. First of all, they've alluded to it in the past. So it's like the extent of it, that it was common practice, isn't out there, but they've said, there were instances of this happening. But yeah, like I have, memos with Hubbard's signature on them corresponding back and forth with a doctor at a treatment facility outside Toronto about a priest who was an admitted child abuser. So then, like, when I send him that and ask him questions about it, he kind of has no choice but to respond to it.
Wow. Now, Hubbard himself is accused of abusing minors as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. There are 7 people who have filed lawsuits alleging that Hubbard personally abused kids. He denies that. His common refrain is just, these haven't been vetted. They're just allegations made in a courtroom. I mean, 7 individuals is a lot. I have a letter that Hubbard wrote for the diocese confidential file on one of their priests back in the 80s. His name's Joseph Romano. He's one of the most common priests listed in CBA lawsuits. He's on the diocese list of offenders. And Hubbard said, to paraphrase, he's like, I keep getting all these stories about this guy abusing kids, and none of them appear to be connected, and there's no evidence of them colluding. So how am I supposed to do anything but take this very seriously? And I would suggest that, given 7 different lawsuits against the bishop, we should follow his own advice and take them very seriously and vet them.
Did you talk to the current bishop, Scharfenberger, about any of this? Did he have a reaction? Has he had a reaction in the past?
I requested an interview with the bishop earlier this summer, and it was basically communicated to me that the diocese wasn't interested in making the bishop available for an interview. The diocese response to this was basically, that was then and this is now. There's new leadership. They've got background checks. They're trying to handle this. They're taking proactive steps to support people that come to them with abuse allegations. So yeah, that's their basic stance, is that they're trying to grow from this and do better.
All right, that's it for this week. I'm Jessica Marshall. We'll be back next week with another look inside the newsroom here at the Times-Union. In the meantime, check us out on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram, or head over to timesunion.com for the latest news and features. The Eagle is a production of the Times-Union. It's produced and edited by me, Jessica Marshall, with help this week from Lori Todd and the Times-Union digital team. Special thanks this week to Casey Seiler and Ed McKinley for their reporting and contribution to this episode.